You've seen most of the files. Who, if anyone, did Epstein traffic these women to besides himself? You replied, according to the transcript, there is no credible information that he trafficked them to anyone else. You also said somewhere in the hearing and here today that the problem is that the case files are constrained by limited search warrants from 2006 to 2007 and that the non-prosecution agreement hamstrung future investigations. Those constraints only apply to the Southern District of Florida. They do not apply to the Southern District of New York, the location of the 2019 sex trafficking indictment, which produced many things, including a series of FD 302 documents. According to victims who cooperated with the FBI in that investigation, these documents in FBI possession, your possession, detail at least 20 men, including Mr. Jess Staley, CEO of Barclays Bank, who Jeffrey Epstein trafficked victims to. Victims including minors, such as Virginia Roberts Giuffre, may she rest in peace. That list also includes at least 19 other individuals, one Hollywood producer worth a few $100 million, one royal prince, one high-profile individual in the music industry, one very prominent banker, one high-profile government official, one high-profile former politician, one owner of a car company in Italy, one rock star, one magician, at least 6 billionaires, including a billionaire from Canada. We know these people exist in the FBI files, the files that you control. I don't know exactly who they are, but the FBI does. Have you launched any investigations into any of these people, and have you seen these 302 documents?
Sir, I have asked my FBI agents to review the entirety of the Epstein files and bring forth any credible information. And we're working with Congress not only to divulge that information and produce it to you, but any investigations that arise from any credible investigation will be brought. There have been no new materials brought to me launching a new indictment.
So is the loophole here, or is it your assertion that these victims aren't credible, that the 302s maybe didn't produce credible statements that rise to a probable cause?
It's not my assertion, sir. It's the assertion of two different United States attorneys' offices from 3 separate administrations who investigated those same materials in lifetime.
Are the 302 documents in the FBI's possession?
They reviewed all that, yes, sir.
And so have you reviewed those 302 documents where the victims name the people who victimized them?
If I personally know, but the FBI has.
September 2025. Washington, D.C. A federal hearing room where nothing is supposed to surprise anyone anymore. And yet, under oath, in front of cameras, with over 100,000 pages of Epstein-related FBI files sitting in the background, one sentence detonates the entire room. Kash Patel, responding just a day earlier in the Senate, says there is no credible information that Jeffrey Epstein trafficked victims to anyone else. No credible information, despite victim interviews, despite FBI 302 forms, despite at least 20 individuals allegedly named by survivors, and nearly 300 gigabytes of seized digital evidence. Then Thomas Massie walks in with 4 documents, places them into the congressional record without objection, and asks a question so simple it sounds almost disrespectful. Have you actually read the files? This is not a normal hearing. This is a pressure test of whether a system can contradict itself in public, and expect no one to notice. Because what happens next is not a Sandekits clash of ideology. It's something more precise, more uncomfortable. A collision between what exists on paper and what is being said out loud. Massie doesn't start with emotion. He starts with receipts. He introduces a statement from former U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, entered into the record, uncontested, claiming he was told to back off Epstein because he belonged to intelligence. Not proven, not confirmed, but not challenged either. And in a courtroom, silence around a statement like that isn't agreement. It's something else. It's caution. Then comes the second layer, the documents, calendar entries, intelligence-linked meetings, a record showing that Ehud Barak met Epstein dozens of times, again, documented, again, unchallenged, not because everyone agrees, but because objecting would require denying records that already exist in the public domain. Now the frame tightens. Massie isolates Patel's statement. No credible information. He doesn't argue emotionally. He doesn't speculate. He simply narrows the scope. That claim, he explains, only holds if you restrict the evidence to a narrow window, the 2006 to 2007 Florida case. But the 2019 New York investigation? Different jurisdiction, different witnesses, different documents, no such limitations. And that's where the contradiction begins to take shape. Because those 2019 investigations produced FBI 302 forms, official interview records, where victims cooperated, gave statements, and named names. Not rumors, not internet speculation. Formal documentation, created by federal agents, stored inside FBI systems. So now the room is forced into a corner. Either those victim statements are credible enough to be documented and archived by the FBI, or they are not credible enough to exist at all. Both cannot be true at the same time, and yet, the system is trying to hold both positions simultaneously. Patel responds carefully, not aggressively, not defensively, carefully. He says agents have reviewed the files, that multiple administrations have looked at the evidence, that nothing has risen to the level of probable cause. Notice the language. Not nothing exists, not no names are present, but nothing has been brought to him that justifies action. That's not a denial. That's a filter. And filters change everything. Because once you admit the documents exist, but redefine the threshold of what counts, you're no longer debating facts. You're controlling which facts are allowed to matter. And that's where the hearing stops being about documents and starts becoming about distance. Distance between the evidence and the person in charge of it. Because when Massie asks the next question, the room doesn't get louder. It gets tighter. He doesn't accuse. He doesn't speculate. He asks something surgical. Have you personally read the 302 forms where victims named their abusers? And Kash Patel says no. Not directly, not explicitly, but clearly enough. He says the FBI has reviewed them. He says agents have gone through the material. He says he relies on their assessments. Translation? The director of the FBI is speaking with certainty about the absence of credible information, without personally reading the statements where that information would exist. That's not a technicality. That's the entire case. Because now the contradiction isn't abstract anymore. It's personal. You're not looking at a disagreement between agencies. You're looking at a gap between what's written and what's been seen by the person making the claim. Massie doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to. He just tightens the logic one more turn. How can you say there are no names if you haven't read the documents that would contain them? That question doesn't attack Patel. It traps the structure around him. Because there are only two ways out. Either the director is correct, and the documents truly contain nothing credible, or the director is relying on filtered summaries, layered interpretations, and internal conclusions that have already decided what counts before he ever looks at the raw material. And that's when the language starts to matter more than the facts. Patel leans into process. He says multiple administrations reviewed the evidence. He says prosecutors determined it didn't meet the threshold for probable cause. He emphasizes institutional continuity, not individual verification. But listen carefully to what's happening. The conversation is shifting from what exists to what qualifies. That's a legal move, a familiar one, because probable cause is a prosecutorial threshold. It is not the standard required for something to be real, to be documented, or to be true enough to investigate further. So now the system is doing something very specific. It's taking the highest bar, probable cause, and using it to redefine the lower ones. If it's not enough to prosecute, it's treated as if it's not enough to acknowledge. That's not law. That's framing. And framing has consequences. Because once you collapse those distinctions, you erase the middle ground where most truth actually lives. Witness statements, corroborating details, patterns, names that appear more than once but never quite cross the legal finish line. Those don't disappear, they just get relabeled. Massie pushes again, but this time he shifts the battlefield. Not documents, not thresholds, people. He brings up the White House event where Epstein-related files were released, not to investigators, not to prosecutors, but to social media influencers. Pause there for a second. The same system that says it must be careful, that it cannot act without meeting strict legal standards, that it must protect the integrity of evidence, was willing to stage a public-facing release designed for viral consumption. And Massie asks a question that cuts straight through that contradiction. If you're willing to show up for influencers, will you sit down with the victims? Not the FBI, not the institution. You, the director. And Patel doesn't say yes. He redirects. He defers. He moves it back to the professionals handling the case. That's not an answer. That's distance again. Distance from documents. Distance from decisions. Now distance from people. And this is where the hearing crosses a line most people don't even notice at first. Not a legal line, not a procedural one, a moral line. Because while the conversation is still dressed in legal language, probable cause, thresholds, review processes, Massie introduces something the system is clearly not prepared to handle in real time: the consequences of speed. He reveals that when Epstein-related files were released to Congress, they were pushed out so quickly, under political pressure, that victim-identifying information was not properly redacted. Stop there. The same system that said it needed caution didn't exercise it when it mattered most. The same system that said it couldn't act without certainty acted fast enough to expose the very people the law was designed to protect. That's not a contradiction anymore. That's a reversal. Because now the victims, the individuals whose statements were deemed not credible enough to pursue, suddenly became visible enough to be exposed. That's the moral inversion at the center of this entire exchange. And no one in the room rushes to challenge it. No objection, no correction, no interruption, just silence. Then Massie shifts again, not to victims, not to FBI process, but to something even harder to pin down: intelligence. He asks the question directly. Have you investigated potential CIA connections to Jeffrey Epstein? And Kash Patel responds the way institutions respond when they step into uncertain territory: carefully, conditionally, with layers. He says he can only speak for the FBI. He says he has reviewed what has been shared with them. He says if such a file exists, and if it has not already been provided, the FBI would look at it. 2 conditions before a commitment: not yes, not no, just space, and that space matters. Because earlier in the hearing, a statement from a former U.S. attorney had already been entered into the record, uncontested, suggesting Epstein was considered connected to intelligence. Again, not proven, but not challenged. And in a setting like this, silence doesn't erase a claim. It stabilizes it. It lets it sit long enough to become something that must eventually be addressed. So now the hearing is holding 3 unresolved realities at the same time. Documents exist. Names exist within those documents. And there may be connections that extend beyond standard criminal investigation into intelligence territory. None of these are fully confirmed. None of them are fully denied. They're just present, and presence is enough to create pressure. Because once something is on the record, once it survives without objection, it changes the posture of everyone in the room. They are no longer debating whether it can be said. They are deciding when and how they will have to respond to it. Massie doesn't try to prove the intelligence connection. He doesn't need to. He just makes it impossible to ignore. And that's the technique. Not explosion, accumulation. One document, then another, then a statement, then a contradiction, then a silence. Each one on its own is manageable. Together, they form a pattern that the system can't easily dismiss without unraveling something larger. And that is the point where everything flips. Not because someone shouted, not because someone confessed, but because the silence itself starts carrying more weight than any answer. Think about what's actually sitting on the table now. Over 100,000 pages of material. Victim statements documented in official FBI records. Names that exist inside those files. A director who has not personally read them. A system that says nothing credible while simultaneously admitting nothing has risen high enough to act. Those pieces don't cancel each other out. They stack. And when they stack, they don't create clarity. They create pressure. Because now, the question is no longer what happened with Epstein. The question is whether the standard for truth has quietly been raised so high that it becomes unreachable. And that's where the moral scene locks into place. Because somewhere outside that hearing room, far from the polished language, far from the procedural framing, are the people who sat across from federal agents and told their stories. They gave names. They answered questions. They signed statements. They entered the system expecting that truth, once documented, would carry weight. But inside that room, their words are being translated into something else. Not false, not disproven, just not enough to move, not enough to act, not enough to matter. And that's the quietest form of erasure there is, because it doesn't deny you outright, it just keeps you permanently below the threshold. Now go back to that moment again. When Thomas Massie placed those documents into the record, no one objected. Not one interruption, not one correction. That doesn't prove the claims, but it proves something just as important. No one in that room was willing to challenge them in real time. And in a setting where objection is the primary tool of defense, that absence matters. Because every unchallenged statement becomes a weight that carries forward into the next hearing, the next interview, the next public conversation. It lingers. It forces a future response. And until that response comes, the gap between what is known and what is acknowledged keeps widening. So ask yourself this. If the files exist, if the names exist, if the victims spoke, if the system reviewed everything, then what exactly is missing? Is it evidence? Or is it the willingness to follow that evidence to its conclusion, no matter where it leads? Because that is the real fracture exposed in this hearing. Not left versus right, not politics versus policy, but accountability versus insulation. A system that can document truth without ever being forced to act on it. And if that's the case, then the final question isn't about Epstein at all. It's about the rule itself. Does the law apply equally when the names get powerful enough? Or does it quietly adjust, raising the bar, narrowing the scope, redefining credibility, until the answer becomes unreachable by design? That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a structural question. And it's sitting there now, on the record, unanswered. So if you've made it this far, you already see what most headlines won't show you. Not the noise, the gap, the distance between what is said and what is actually done. If that gap concerns you, don't just scroll past it. Like the video. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who still thinks this was just another hearing. And subscribe, because the next time this comes up, the silence might not hold.